I'm just going to try to position myself here. It feels so funny that you are here. Some of the people who are at the panel here at the Finnish Institute, at the same time you are there, people on Zoom. But we are happy about that. And I'm going to now first introduce yourself, people who are here, and then we carry on with our evening on Philhellenism. So now, first of all, this year, which is now drawing towards its last weeks, has been the celebration bicentenary, outbreak of the Greek War of Independence or Revolution, how you want to put it. There's been, of course, an array of academic and cultural events on themes relating to this anniversary. And of course, Philhellenism, which could be defined in many ways. Roughly, for instance, it could be understood as a favorable disposition towards the Greeks, or more literally, fondness for the Greeks or friendship with the Greeks and so on. This has understandably been and taken up in various contexts and occasions. There's been exhibitions, discussions and scholarly endeavors during this year in Greece in particular. We here at the Finnish Institute, we intended to contribute to this by organizing an international colloquium with the title Other Philhellenisms, Northeastern Perspectives on Slavic and Baltic Philhellenism. It should have actually taken place these days now, and it should have been an international colloquium, people being present here. But we all know the reasons as to why an international conference turned out to be an impossible conundrum in the current pandemic situation. But we're nevertheless carrying out our Other Philhellenism project, and now we are more than happy to have been able to gather here at the Finnish Institute today a group of scholars, very distinguished small group of panelists who are going to enlighten us the topic of Philhellenism nevertheless. And we are extremely happy about that. And many thanks for being with us, all of you who are now on Zoom, particularly those of you who should have been here in Athens today in our colloquium. But let's try to regard this just as a first step to continue. Now in our title, The Other Philhellenisms, it could be seen as a reference to the fact that regardless of various influential aspects of Philhellenism in the Slavic and Baltic cultural spheres, the phenomenon in Russia, in the Baltic states and Scandinavia has received far less scholarly attention than its role in other parts of Europe and beyond. Getting to know more about Eastern or more Eastern Philhellenism is a welcome, as we believe, welcome contribution to Philhellenism studies and will significantly add to new insights to its traditional focus. So we also wish to provide a possibility to ask anew what Philhellenism actually was and what it is. Today, this evening, this will be done first and foremost by our main speaker, Antonia Dialla, and then we continue with our panelists on this topic and maybe a more general discussion as well. So we have one of the best possible of the scholars to give us a talk tonight on our topic of Eastern Philhellenism under the title Russian Philhellenism, Inventing Greece, Reinventing Europe. Dialla is Professor of European and Russian History at the Department of Theory and History of Art, School of Fine Arts in Athens. She has studied history at the School of History, State University of Moscow, also at the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Athens, and at the Department of Political Science of the University of Athens. She has been a visiting researcher at the Russian Academy of Science in St. Petersburg, at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and at the Jordan Center for Advanced Studies in Russia of New York University and at the Princeton University. She's a founding member and chairwoman of the Athens-based governing board of the Research Center for the Humanities and a member of the supervisory committee of the Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies in Venice. Her main research interests are the 19th and the 20th century Russian and European history, Russian-Greek transcultural relations, history of humanitarian interventions, and Russian-Soviet history and historiography. Ada's recent book is co-authored with Alexis Heraklides and is entitled Humanitarian Intervention in the Long 19th Century from Manchester University Press 2015. And most recent scholarly articles from the last couple of years or so go with the titles, for instance, Thinking Europe on Europe's Margins, Alexander Sturza, Konstantinos Ikonomos and Russian Greek Orthodoxy in the early 19th century, and the Congress of Vienna, the Russian Empire, and the Greek Revolution, Rethinking Legitimacy. So with this, we welcome now very warmly Ada to talk us on Russian Philhellenism.
Good evening. Thank you for your kind invitation. Thank you, Petra, for your kind words and for your efforts to do this thing tonight. The news of uprising in Morea gave rise in Russia, as in the case of the rest of Europe, to the creation of the multifaceted Philhellenic movement. The question of Russian Philhellenism has not been adequately studied in Greek historiography, and until recently, the international bibliography had neglected the Russian station in the European voyage of the Philhellenic ideas by comparison to British and French Philhellenism. A possible explanation for this neglect is that Philhellenism has been associated with the concept of society and its active role in politics. From this vantage point, Britain and France are considered the two countries which were at the time as liberal par excellence, with society having acquired considerable weight, mainly the educated public, in political life. On the contrary, Russia is seen as a country with an autocratic system of government where the state wields such weight that it crushes society. In spite of this, I see another image of Russia, which has been brought to the fore by the post-Soviet Russian and foreign historians. From the 18th to 20th century onwards, Russia witnessed an array of social manifestations, namely Masonic logs, theatres, salons, clubs. Finally, the press, which saw a huge development together with visual culture. As a result of these developments, the Tsarist authority did not have an absolute control on the public domain, as was previously the case. In my opinion, we have to consider the centrality of the Russian political and intellectual factor in the study of the Greek Revolution, with its complex cultural matrix, which consisted of a combination of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, linked with Christian Orthodox religiosity, with roots in Byzantine culture, with the appeal also to the ancient Greek heritage, let alone that the preparation of the Greek struggle for independence had taken place in part on Russian soil. At that time, Russia was a vast multicultural, multi-ethnic, a hybrid of traditional and modern components empire, where expatriate Balkan peoples, Greeks or Greek speakers, participated in Russian and international political, cultural, and economic networks. In these networks, people, discourses, and practices traveled in space and time in various directions, from west to east, from north to south, and the other way around, both influencing and being influenced by novel cultural trends. In what is to follow, I have taken into consideration a point raised by Lucia Droulia, a Greek student on Philhellenism, namely that Philhellenism is broad and means different things to different people, then and now. Droulia has rightly pointed out that Philhellenism was not only a movement for the Greek cause. As he has wrote, in the name of Philhellenism were incorporated the ideological political rivalries of domestic politics, while in their international diplomatic juxtapositions, governments found a fertile pretext for mobility so as to consolidate their country's ambit of influence. In other words, we can say that the multiple movement of Philhellenism has at last two interconnected facets. One refers to the interior of the societies which merged with political demands, and the other, it was a strong movement of support that expressed itself in the Old World and the New World, in Asia also, for the liberation of the revolutionary Greeks. Moreover, the Philhellenic discourse was a product of intercultural networks which involved people, texts, and objects on the move. In Russia, Philhellenism as a movement was supporting revolutionaries, expressed itself in poems, articles, fiery calls, gathering funds, the creation of various active committees and societies, and so on. And of course, there was the press, which with its flow of circulator created what Gary Bass has called in his book Freedom's Battle, devoted to humanitarian intervention, imagined humanity. Furthermore, it seems to me the most researchers would agree that the Philhellenic discourse includes and is based on three main themes. First, religion, namely Christian religion, which in those days witnessed various changes in Europe as well as in Russia, as a vehicle reshaping society, with Christianity associated with civilization and Europe as Christian civilization. Second, antiquity, with Greek antiquity as cradle of civilization, actually European civilization, which was then seen as global. Third, humanitarianism. When the Greek Revolution erupted, politicians, intellectuals, and public figures, all those who could speak, write, and comment on what was happening among the Orthodox Greeks of the Ottoman Empire, had no difficulty in associating the uprising with the discourse of slavery, with the Christian population of the Sublime Porte as having been enslaved by the Sultan and as victims of various barbarities. From the first moment, the scenery that was set in motion in European public opinion was a vocabulary which was intended to evoke humanitarian sentiments. Words such as extermination, annihilation, effusion of blood, massacres, and slavery were in common use. All of them were connected to the idea of violation of natural rights, human rights, and traveled through the Philhellenic discourse, diplomatic documents, and the printed word from document to document, from lips to lips, from one journal to another. All three are aspects of that discourse which erects the edifice of being European in contradistinction to what is not European, and it builds what in the second part of the 19th century is the bipolar Manichaean image of civilized nation and barbarian ones. Russian Philhellenism included these three themes, and dependent on who was involved, there was greater emphasis on slavery, or common religion, or antiquity. Note that the Russians, though absent from the military theater in the Greek lands, were very active in freeing slaves by sending money to the Ottoman and Egyptian who had enslaved Greeks and other Orthodox Christians. The Russians, mainly politicians, diplomats, and clergymen, formed that Theophilus Prussis, the main expert of Russian Philhellenism, has called the War Party, with the Corfiot patriot and Russian foreign minister, Ioannis Kapodistrias, as their unofficial leader. Most Russians put their emphasis on religion, and as the revolution unfolded, they accepted the basic thrust of the revolutionaries that it is not related to the other contemporary revolts in Southern Europe, namely Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese cases. Basically, that it is not an uprising aimed at democratic rule and the constitution, but one which is national and religious. One of these politicians and intellectuals was, for example, Alexander Sturza, of Moldavian and Phanariot origins. Sturza served as the secretary of Kapodistrias at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Sturza was a visionary of a new European order. As we know, the construction of Europeanism was also associated with the process of national construction in Europe. Sturza regarded religion not only as the core of the national identity, but also as the core of spiritual and political renewal of Europe. Obviously, his concept of Europe, founded on religion, excluded the diachronic other of Christian Europe, namely the Ottoman Empire and Islam. Sturza was motivated by a religious and political enmity towards the Ottoman Empire, in which he insisted the Orthodox were oppressed. Within this context, one can place his concern for the Greeks as well for the Serbians. He regarded the fate of the Orthodox Church of the Russians and the Greeks as tragic, for it was under Islamic oppression, yet vibrant in its belief and support for the liberation of the faithful. The Greek cause was perceived as parallel to the Tatar-Mongolian yoke suffered by the Russians in the 13th to 15th centuries. Not having been assimilated, the Greeks, under the authority of the Patriarchate, were not the subject of a legitimate European monarch, but the tributaries of the Sultan. Moreover, the Ottoman Empire could not be regarded as part of the European political system, which was based on Christianity. Sturza, by using concepts such as faith, honor, defense of life and people, and the concept of the inevitability of Ottoman decline, disassociated the Greek Revolution from the dangerous secular ideas of the French Revolution. In addition, he retained a special mission for Orthodox Russia as the worthy would be liberators of the Orthodox populations and especially of the Greeks. Upgrading Orthodoxy with the new Europe and within Russia was in harmony with its stance regarding Greek emancipation. Orthodoxy and the Greek language as symbol of unity for all the Orthodox were to be the common political and cultural bonds between Russia and the Balkans that would unite the Greek Orthodox world within a Christian community. The opposition strata, and most of all the liberal army officers, the future Decembrists, did not omit the religious aspect, perceived the Greek uprising as a link in the chain of uprisings, linking them to those in Italy and Spain. Nevertheless, they regarded the Greek Revolution as an act against the old regime, similar to the revolts in the Italian and the Spanish cases, whose aim, according to the liberals, had been to rebuild Europe along constitutional and national lines. And this development will give rise to an overall uprising against all forms of tyranny, be it Turkish, Russian, or other. After 1821, they diverted their attention to the possibility of a wider Balkan uprising that could also signal the beginning of a revolutionary movement in Russia itself, overthrowing Tsarist despotism. And they believed that one of the key for success was revolutionary international networks and bonds. In their poetry, the Russian liberals and nationalists made ample use of ancient Greek traditions, motifs, and heroes. This was also the case with the conservatives. The difference was in the different horizons of concepts such as freedom, fatherland, tyranny, and the right of people to resistance to it. These concepts were to be found everywhere, but in the case of most Decembrists, their tone was not only anti-Ottoman, as was the case with the conservatives, but also against European and Russian absolutism. The future Decembrists saw the Greek Revolution as the expression of their own visions: social and political freedoms, patriotism, emancipation of the serfs, constitutional government, the evolution of the concept of citizenship. For them, the Ottoman Empire was not only the state of the infidel barbarians, as to barbarity they were in agreement with the conservatives, but also the most harsh tyranny, with its absolute authority with no bounds, which acted as the model for European absolutism. As put by the liberal poets, the vile tyrants of Europe, who with their scepter perennially dominate the somber peoples of the East. In this context, the real goal were not the modern Greeks under the mantle of the glory of the ancients, but rather political uses of the Greek struggle and the political uses of Greek antiquity, a European construction which symbolized the antagonism between liberals and monarchists. At that time, there was a dual definition of Europe. On the one hand, Metternich's new absolutist European order of Christian monarchies, and on the other, the Europe of constitutional governance. The definition of Europeanism was personal, subjective, and strategic. For the Russian conservatives, it was a commonwealth of monarchs united by Christianity, and hence morally equal in their quest to subdue revolutionary tendencies. For the liberal, it was power based on constitution. Alexander Pushkin, the national poet of Russia, the Russian Byron, at that time in exile in Chisinau, commented in a letter in March 1821, "The first step of Ypsilantis was beautiful and remarkable. His start is happy, and whether dead or alive, he is from now on part of history. 28 years old, with an arm cut, magnanimous the goal, enviable the fate." A few days later, he wrote in his diary, "Yesterday I was in an exquisite Greek lady. We spoke of Alexander Ypsilantis. There were 5 Greeks present. Only I spoke like a true Greek. They could not believe in the success of the Eteria, but I adamantly believe that Greece will triumph and the 25 million Turks will be obliged to leave flowery Greece to the legitimate inheritors of Homer and Themistocles." As claimed by some Soviet and Russian historians, the future Decembrists were informed of the Philiki Eteria's preparation of the uprising, and this was certainly the case for General Raevsky or General Orlov and some others. The most informed was General Orlov, who arrived in Chisinau in June 1820 as head of the 16th Army Division. Orlov, with Ypsilantis, discussed and jointly elaborated the plans for the arrival of the Eteris to Moldavia, and they also discussed military assistance to the Greek rebels. Orlov, who knew the organizational structure of the Philiki Eteria, shared the principles of strict discipline and the strict adherence to the decision of the high authority, which he tried to instill in the Congress of the Union of Prosperity in Moscow in January 1821. This was a secret society of the Russian liberals. However, in their constitutional quest, the future Decembrists were mainly influenced by the Spaniards and had difficulty understanding the nebulous political ideas of the Eterists. They were mainly concerned with the organizational aspects of the Eteria and the major issue of popular participation in the liberation struggle. As claimed by the Russian historian Orlik, the Decembrists compare the experience of the Greek, Spanish and Italian cases, and this reinforced discussions on the role of the people in the desired Russian uprising. Moreover, the nebulous political ideas of the Eterists made them elaborate in more detail their own political goals. The Decembrists of the South did not join as volunteers, but were supportive of the military intervention to the Greeks. First, due to their desire that Russia assist what they regarded as a just cause, and second, because they believed that a victorious liberation war in the Balkans would be a powerful blow to the Holy Alliance and would be the start of a liberation struggle in the whole of Europe and Russia. The American historian Richard Stites claims the Russians did not become volunteers, for many of them were exiled in Siberia and the rest were primarily concerned with conspiratorial activity in their own country. However, they were supportive of a European revolutionary brotherhood as seen with pastel projects for the liberation of Europe through a Balkan war. Concluding, the Greek 1821 posed the question, how were people in the 18th century imagining their future? The Greek Revolution was perceived as a cause for hope by European contemporaries, including Russians. The Russian poet and diplomat Wilhelm Küchelbecker, upon hearing of the Greek uprising, jotted down his Greek song while in Paris on a diplomatic mission. History walks toward a glorious aim. History has arrived. All the surroundings are old. Institutions, laws, manuscripts and books. People, rise from your sleep. Wake up. Joy. The hour of freedom has arrived. As we know, the notion of Europe, Europeanism, shaped the semantics of the 1821 revolution. But the notion of Europe was not, and it is not, self-evident. Europe did not have and does not have clearly defined geographical and cultural boundaries. The geographical, political, cultural and mental boundary was, and is, constantly under negotiation. Greek revolutionaries insisted that their struggle was based on European principles and was within the confines of Europe. The same believed the Russian Philhellenists, conservatives and liberals. Thus, the Greek Revolution became a negotiation and a renegotiation of the European frontiers. Changing the frontier meant that the notion of Europe and the meaning of the Europeanization were changing too. Russian Philhellenists, defining the rebel Greeks, they invented and reinvented Europe and at the same time interpreted and reinterpreted their national and imperial identities.
Thank you so much, Ada. It was wonderful to hear on Russian Philhellenism. This was a beautiful introduction. This was with very deep and overthought notions there. I'm sure that we will have very good food for talk. This evening, I mentioned earlier that we have here a couple of persons. I'm going to introduce them to you before we open the discussion in the panel. And then in the end, we may welcome some questions from the audience in Zoom as well. I'm going to go in alphabetical order for this big four-person table here. So Elizabeth Fowden is a senior researcher at the University of Cambridge, UK. She's a cultural historian whose work focuses on the intersections of Hellenism, Christianity and Islam. The forthcoming monograph on the Parthenon Mosque explores the much neglected Muslim engagement with the Greek antiquity. She's principal co-organizer with Tim Wismas and Arja Karivieri in a collaborative project which is entitled Greece Between Europe and Asia. It's also one part of Finnish Institute's other Philhellenism networks. Next panelist from the right, from the Elizabeth, George Kalpadakis is an assistant researcher in foreign policy at the Modern Greek History Research Center of the Academy of Athens and Fulbright Scholar at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. He has been a visiting scholar at the Center of Development Studies at the University of Cambridge and is currently a research fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. His two main works, monographs, focus on the Macedonian issue and the Cyprus question from World War II to the post-Cold War period. Actually, the very recent the Cyprus question, 1954 to 1974, was published as recently as last year. Or was it this year? This year. George's research interests concern foreign policy and nationalism, civil society, state building and regional cooperation in Southeastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean from the 19th century until the present day. He's currently preparing a book on Kapodistrias, the Filikieteria and the Russian connection, which focuses on the idea of constructing a Balkan confederation in the post-Ottoman era. He's also preparing a short monograph with Professor Vasilis Sabatakakis on Swedish Philhellenism during the Greek Revolution. And I think the collaboration, Vasilis Sabatakakis is with us this evening on the other side of the screen. Then Dialla, I have already introduced to all of you. And we go to our last panelist, Mogens Pelt, who is a director of the Danish Institute at Athens, working now here on leave from his position as associate professor in international history at the University of Copenhagen. He's directing the research project at the Greek Revolution and European Republicanism, 1815 to 1830, Ideas of Nation, People and Citizenship in the Making of the Constitutional State. He's also co-director of the Center Many Roads to Modernity, Southeastern Europe and its Ottoman Roads at the University of Copenhagen. He sits also in the board of the Center of the Study of Nationalism at the University of Copenhagen and has worked in the Princeton University, first as a visiting fellow at the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and following he was also at the Princeton University as a research fellow to investigate such an intriguing topic as the Danish Security Intelligence Service. Mogens has carried out research also on political institutions of Southeastern Europe in historical comparative perspectives and has published widely. The titles of his books show his large scholarly coverage, including such topics as, and titles of monographs, as Military Intervention and A Crisis of Democracy in Turkey from the year 2014, Tying Greece to the West, American, West German, Greek relations from 1945 to 1974. This was from the year 2006. And then there is this wonderful book, Tobacco, Arms and Politics, Greece and Germany from World Crisis to World War from 1929 to 41. So, and Mogens has, of course, also published lots of articles on very interesting topics, and some of them really do touch also the thematics that we have been discussing this evening. I myself here, in the role of the director of the Finnish Institute at Athens, but tonight actually I am in fact sitting on two chairs. Namely, also my own scholarly interests are amongst more ancient and classicist topics, also firmly rooted in the theme of Philhellenism, particularly the reflections, effects, and the conceptual or practical use of the phenomenon in the Nordic countries, Finland especially. And these topics I discussed in a book I published already 2006 under the title August Mörberg and North European Philhellenism. And after that, I have considered the issues in several later publications. We have also one person who is not here physically, but is on Zoom. He has collaborated a lot with the Philhellenism project, Fredrik Whitling, who joins us now from the north himself. He's historian and has been helping and collaborating with other Philhellenisms. He's historian with the PhD from the University Institute in Florence and has studied and published both monographs and articles, for example, on the history and formation of the scholarly and archaeological academic institutions in the Mediterranean. Also on the history of the formation of archaeological heritage and patronage of arts, as well as historical and cultural studies. So now, after this introduction, I am going to open the discussion. I was thinking at the same time when you gave your talk, and your title is also, it's a grand title, and it is a title which reflects really the Russian Philhellenism as something that also played a role. You referred in the end of the talk that, of course, as we know, this was the time when the Europe and the nation state still, some of the barriers were in the making. They always are in one way, but particularly then they were clearly so. What do we think here? How much was Russia there, this kind of a famous, I wouldn't say the other, but a reflection point to form definitions through slight difference?
Russia is a very interesting case because Russia is another other of the European, let's say, center of the West, of the European West. But the interest point here is that at that time, after the Napoleonic Wars, Russia was at the center of all the European politics. And I can say that Russian and Orthodoxy was very strong. And Russian politicians like Sturza, let's say, or Kapodistrian or Alexander I, they thought that Russia has an equal basis in Europe. Of course, Russia was a very diverse country and there were a lot of different currents and so on. But we can see that at that time, most of the politicians and public opinion were Europeanists, but a different kind of Europeanists. There were conservatives, there were liberals, and the Greek case was a starting point to think and rethink their position in Europe. But I can say that at that time, Russia, of course, some of intellectuals perceive Russia as, let's say, as a culture in between, as Larry Wolff has already characterized Russia's position. But Russia at that time was at the height of her influence, and so this is. But you know, this position Russia lost after the Crimean War. And it is very interesting that this Russian hope, η ρωσική προσδοκία, and that's a Russian expectation, it was not only a Greek case. You know, also the Italians revolutionaries, the Spanish, the Portuguese, they hope that Russia will assist them. It's very interesting. Russia's position in Europe at that time.
Do you others have a comment on this?
Yes, at least it's a kind of question, actually. And this I mean, there were many Philhellenisms in Russia, according to what I could understand. And there's one strand which is at least intriguing me a little bit, and this is what you find among the Decembrists, who, if I understood you well, were understanding the Greek Revolution in terms of republicanism, patriotism, or even nationalism, I guess, of the nation, people, and also perhaps a virtue. I mean, these kind of elements which are so important if you're looking at a concept like republicanism, which lost its traction, at least as an idea, because of the effects after the Napoleonic Wars. So my question is something like, how articulate were the Decembrists in their formulation, or if they're mentioning of these, let's say, virtues of constitutionalism? I guess it was kind of movement which wanted to reform culture, to change it. Was it the movement primarily informed, or it's difficult to answer, I know, apart from the Greek Revolution, which of course could be seen as a kind of a light, as a thing to lead, what other, let's say, channels of influence, or possible influence of constitutionalism and these things were they exposed to? I mean, they had been, exactly as you said, participating in the, I mean, Russia had been participating in the Napoleonic Wars. They had seen what happened in the areas where the French came and erected new institutions. So how much of this is reflected in this group? And did it last? I mean, I know they lost their battle and their existence, I think, in 1825 or something of the kind. So it's, well, a question perhaps not, but number of themes you might have something to enlighten us on.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. Decibels were the future decibels, okay? Let's say the future decibels during the Napoleon Wars were the army officers who fought against Napoleon. They went through the Russian army until to the Paris and so on. And they could see how people live outside Russia. But before this, they belonged to the Masonic lodges and all this, the international network was a channel for new ideas, and they discussed a lot this concept of virtue of citizen and what is a nation, what is empire, what is religion, what is all these new concepts, what is Petra, Rodina. And after the invasion of Napoleon to Russia and Moscow, they debated a lot the concept of people, of narod. This was all very, very, very interesting and they followed the trends in the United States, the Constitution of the United States, and also the Cardiff Constitution. They admired the Cardiff Constitution. And not so much, of course, the Constitution of the United States, but the Cardiff Constitution, I feel that for them was the top. So they had different channels to think and debate all these things. And for them, the crucial issue was the abolition of serfdom. In other words, how we can create a nation. But in a nation within an empire, okay? Because it is very interesting that decimalists were liberal, nationalists, and they loved their empire, and they hated Ottoman Empire. So they thought that some nations like Greeks had the right to be free, but nations and other groups, let's say in Caucasus or in Central Asia, they have not this right because they are undeveloped and they have to be under the civilized Russians. So this is
George Kalpadakis.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And just a small comment, a question about what you talked about, political uses of Philhellenism. And I'm just wondering, because I see a kind of Philhellenism that is, in the Russian case, kind of state-sanctioned. And I see it more of as an outgrowth of Russian nationalism since Catherine the Great and afterwards. So I'm wondering whether you also find, especially with the Decembrist example, that there is a much sharper, let's say, juxtaposition between this type of Philhellenism and actual Russian policy, which was much more, let's say, pragmatically grounded on the weak neighbor policy, on the idea that we have to keep the Ottoman Empire together.
Thank you. Great question. First of all, I think that we have to imagine that Russian government and Russian foreign policy was not one thing. There were different trends and the different, let's say, groups had different visions of what the best Russian foreign policy is towards the Ottoman Empire, toward Europe. But they had, I have to say that they had a global vision of all this, because the Ottoman Empire was connected not only with the Mediterranean, but also with the Caucasus, Afghanistan, and Persia. So it was complicated, okay. And for them, Europe, it was not only Europe. For them, Spain, let's say, was not only Spain, but it was Latin America and new trade routes. And so it was complicated, okay. Catherine the Great, the second, had several plans to, not to destroy the Ottoman Empire. There were some plans, but she did these plans with the Austrian emperor. Okay, they spoke on this and they forgot this plan. Kapodistrias, as a foreign minister, before the Greek Revolution and until 1822, when he was foreign minister, he believed that Russia had to be more aggressive toward Ottoman Empire because he believed that Ottoman Empire has not been in Europe. His vision, not only of Kapodistrias, but Sturza and many other people who were from Ottoman Empire, Armenians, Phanariots and so on, they advised the Russian Tsar to expel Ottomans to Asia. But Nesserod, the other foreign minister of Russia at that time, had a different position. And also the Emperor Alexander, because they were tied to the European treaties, and they believed that they have to act in agreement with other European countries. So, it is not one policy, but at that time, Kapodistrias lost his position because Alexander's vision of the new Europe was stronger. And this is very strange. It was a very strange situation because the Philhellenists, and were a lot of Philhellenists in the Russian government, and conservatives and clerics, a lot of people were against Ottomans and wanted to Russia to go to war against Ottoman Empire. But Nestor and Alexander I were very, very believed to the European unity and these holy alliances they had in their mind.
So I want to pick up on that, and I'm very interested in positioning Russia, or hearing your views of whether we can position Russia not only in connection with Europe, as in your title, but also its place at a time, the 19th century, when people are using increasingly this binary between East and West. Russia was very aware that it had a strong connection, as you were just saying, with Asia, and also Greece. So I'd be interested in hearing more about that complexity of the relationship of the Russian identity, and where, at that point, the Orthodox Byzantine tradition comes in, because this is exactly the time in the 19th century when archaeology, ways of using archaeology for nationalist interests is, yes, focusing on the classical past, the Hellenic past, but also it's the rise of, really the creation and rise of that Byzantine archaeology and that Byzantine identity. A lot of great Russian Byzantinists are rising up to great prominence at this point. And so I'm interested in how that, the interest in the material culture and the acquisition of objects, creation of museums, the Russian Institute in Constantinople, the way in which you find this creative tension between an Eastern and Western, a European and Asian identity in Russia, is played out through archaeology and its diplomatic potential.
Oh, it's really a complex question. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russia, very complex, I had to say, polity, and their cultural trends, and they believe they belong to the ancient Greek heritage. They have the ancient Greek heritage because of the Crimea. The Crimea is very, very, very crucial in all this self-image of Catherine II and many, many, many others. Okay, and of course they had a lot of archaeological works there, and this enforced their belief that they belong to the Western civilization, European Western civilization. But also they had all this Byzantine culture, because which was a culture. They present, as was for Greeks also.
Yes.
Okay, and the founding father of the Byzantine studies in Russia was a Greek. It was the Stounis. The Stounis was a friend of Sturza, Kapodistria, from Ionian Islands, who served at Smyrna when erupted the Greek Revolution. He fled the Smyrna because of the Turkish Ottoman Adipina, how to say? And he, with his son, they founded the Byzantine studies, and they started to build Byzantine archaeology studies and so on. They were not so active outside Russia to build their institutions, and like Germans or they had an archaeological institute in Constantinople, but they founded this at the end of the 19th century. Until that, they tried something to do. They had the Palestinian society in Jerusalem. And this was a very interesting aspect with pilgrims and so on. But the Russians themselves, they had their own ways. They thought that they are Europeans. But until the end of the 19th century, there were some conservatives that thought that their Europeanism was something like, not conservative, that before the liberal Europe. They admired the ancient Europe. So they were critics toward the capitalist Europe, from the conservative points, not from the other side, okay? At the end of the 19th century, I started to have more complex ideas about their identity, and they invented this identity, the Eurasian identity.
Yes.
Yes, this is a very, very, very interesting aspect, but
Yes,
it's essentially related. On the other side, the Europeans perceived the Russians, as I said, in the edge of the Europe. Let's say Napoleon, before the invasion to Russia in 1912, he used the image of the barbarians under the gates, and he and his advisors wrote a lot of pamphlets about barbarity of Russia, of alterity of Russia. But after the Russia and Alexander pushed Napoleon from Russia, and Alexander perceived in Europe at that time as the liberator of Europe, as a fighter against tyranny of Napoleon and so on, Russia became something more balanced. The image of Russia was more balanced. And intellectuals, because Alexander Sturza is very interesting intellectual, because he was a politician, he was an intellectual, he wrote in many languages, especially in French, and he tried to translate all his works in French, Russian, Greek also. So he was famous in Europe. He wrote a book where he insisted that orthodoxy was the true religion of Europe. And he wrote this treaty against the Joseph de Maistre work on paper. And the Maistre wrote to his friends that, okay, there is some Sturza who was born in some place, I don't know, but he writes in perfect French and his ideas are great. I can say that the beginning of the 19th century was the Russian moment in Europe, a moment. And after that...
What happened then?
Then Russia, during the revolution of 1848, lost her reputation as not a liberal, but okay. Alexander I was, Europeans admired Alexander I. After became Nicholas I. And he helped Austrians to crush the Hungarian Revolution in 1848. And this was, the image of Russia was the image of an oppressive state and reactionary state and so on. And after that became the Crimean War, 1856. Russia lost the war and everybody perceived this situation as, because Russia was, a giant with πύληνα πόδια, And after that, the perception of Russia in Europe was that Russia, okay, it is not European, it's European, but not European, because it was not, this country was not liberal and had not this constitution and so on. Russians themselves started their great reforms. Among the Russian society, there were two trends, the Europeanists and the Slavophiles, and they fought between them. But the Slavophiles also, they were a kind of admirers of Europe.
Yes, this is the question that maybe would like you all to comment briefly as well, which concerns this idea that we have had. So we may be wrong in that, but could it be just because there has been, Russia has been regarded in Europe in different kind of ways, and different, as you now say, that there was a moment when there was more European. Of course, that has been also within in Russia itself. There is a much more clear European opening the windows towards Europe phase, and then something than when the windows are being kept more closed. So now, in terms of Philhellenism, because I mentioned in the beginning that we do know much less about Philhellenism in Russia, in the Slavic cultural spheres, as well as in the Balticum. Might this be because of the reasons? Why is this so? Could it be because of the perception of Russia from the European point of view is shifting back and forth on being very European, a little bit European, sometimes even anti-European.
Just picking up on something that Adam mentioned before about reforms in Russia, because there is this perception that after the war, the 1850s, they lost the war, the Crimean War. There was a big push for reform, for westernization, for Europeanization. But I also think that a very interesting episode was precisely had to do with the Greek Revolution, because you see that during that time, there was this grassroots pressure that sort of led up to the Decembrist revolt. And this thing pushed forth reforms, kind of introspection and modernization. In what way? Well, first of all, I think they did it because following the Austrian example, so they started in the 1820s building this kind of state apparatus, this coercion and surveillance, in order to, find who these Decembrists were, or the proto-Decembrists before that. And the other thing is that through this apparatus, which was based on kind of modernization, because this modernization is not, good or bad, you have to take it as it is. It's the state, the modern state. Through this, they also managed to purge the more radical Russian Philhellenism. So by the time you get to the Russo-Turkish War in 1828-29, by the time you get there, it's a make or break point. They've already purged what they had to purge. The first time they actually got interested in seeing very seriously what this thing called Philiki Eteria was in 1825, 4 years after its demise. So they try to set up this committee to find out and report who are these people, why are they claiming they had Russian support, what happened, and so on. And actually in 1821, there's just another small point, they had sent Dashkov, who was a very high-level, functionary close to the Tsar. They had sent him on this tour throughout the consulates of the Russian Empire in the Balkan Peninsula, in order to present some reforms for these afterwards, because they'd realized that all these revolutionaries were infiltrating, mainly Greeks, so they wanted to purge that. And they didn't have time to, because the Greek Revolution broke out. So that's also very interesting, I think, to see how modernization and reforms sort of connects and in this stage of the Greek Revolution.
Yes, it is a very interesting point, but in addition, I think that there is two moments in this discussion, I think. The moment of 1821 and the moment of bibliography and historiography, that is another life of 1821. In this another life, Russia was perceived as a very, very, very conservative and authoritarian state without society. And usually we perceive Philhellenism as something that belongs to society, to the free politics of society. And this, I think, is one reason why in Greece also, but in other countries, this kind of Philhellenism is not, the Russian Philhellenism was not studied. In Russia, there are a lot of studies that examine this trend in Russian society. But I feel that people who work on Philhellenism, sometimes they exaggerate this trend of Philhellenism, how massive it was in European societies. I think that, of course, that it was massive, but it was massive together with the Slavic campaign and the abolitions and so on. And after the Greek Revolution, after the establishment of Greek state, all these people started to think in a different way about Greeks. And we can there see this colonial gaze. Past Philhellenism changed their minds. And after that, in Balkan, appears other people also, Slavs. So they had to see them also. And they had visibility. For Russian, of course, they had more visibility. From the Russian point of view, all this was a Balkan peninsula. Even for Capodistria. When Capodistria wanted to free Greeks or to pass Ottomans to Asia, he had in his mind Serbs. Not Romanians, because Romanians was not, but Bessarabia, Principalities, Moldavia, Wallachia, and finally Greece.
Maybe I'll name
Mogens, Pelt.
Yes, this is also about Russia. It's not a big surprise, but it is on relevant of a scale in the early period of Russia's, let's say, entrance into the European scene, also before the European wars, the Napoleonic Wars. There are two things I want to say. It's still an attempt to open a discussion more than actually a question. But first of all, the division between East and West was a new one in the 18th century. It used to be North and South. It was not, and we have all these people, the philosophers who lived in the North, who slowly started to change this line of division, of development and underdevelopment. Now, if you follow the trajectory of Russia's role in European politics, I mean, it starts up in the north, around the Baltic, fighting Sweden. It was a good ally of Denmark, and they came out victorious of the Great Nordic Wars in the 1720. And then the thrust would move, at least during Catherine, to southwards towards the Ottoman Empire. Now, my questions and my thoughts concern or circling around Poland, Russia, but also the Ottoman Empire, through the prism of the correspondence between Catherine and Voltaire. I mean, if you go back to 1770, to the Orlov insurrection, Voltaire is framing this in terms of ancient Greeks. Her son, I think, Caterina's son, was designated to sit in Constantinople or somewhere like that. And then you have the partition of Poland, which at least, I'm not a specialist in the partition of Poland, but this was formulated, among other things, as an intervention between the aristocracy in order to establish some kind of a more unifying kingdom. I know it was in the national interest or the dynastic interest of Russia to do so. But if you look at that, let's say, gesture from outside or intervention from outside, it could also look like a model, perhaps, for what could happen in the Ottoman Empire, which had the same kind of construction, a very loosely united confederation or something of a kind of thing. It's Ilijak's word, but it is a very apt description. And you have these people in the Danubian principalities who go for Russian intervention, get very disappointed actually, and move, I mean, in a very dramatic way from, so it seems in the beginning, from hoping for Russian support to French republicanism. It looks like a big divide, but perhaps it is something else actually. So the role of Russia, the impact here, it doesn't seem like to be a conservative factor in European politics. It has a very different quality, and it's not looked upon, I think, at least not when you go to Denmark, as especially Eastern power as such. It's a Baltic actor. So perhaps there's a loss in this period. But, and this is perhaps my final try to formulate a question, did the partition of Poland impact opinion of societies in Russia in terms of seeing it having a mission or arguing for intervention against the Ottoman Empire along the same kind of lines?
It is difficult. I think that I am not able to answer to this, but I can mention an interesting detail after the partition of Poland. And Catherine and Alexander I, as we know, Alexander I was a very close friend with Adam Czartoryski. Adam Czartoryski was a foreign minister before Kapodistria, or Russian foreign minister. And Adam Czartoryski is the other Kapodistrias, the Polish Kapodistrias, because he was from a small nation, let's say small. Poland was not a small nation, it was a great nation before the partitions and so on, but there was a small nation, okay. And he was a foreign minister, and after that he became the national leader of the Polish liberation movement. But at that time, when he was a foreign minister, he wrote some memorandums to Alexander I, and he advised that he had to work with principalities, and he also advised that Alexander had to have a Balkan policy and to create there in Balkan region buffer states against the Ottoman Empire and against other enemies of Russia. And the plans of Czartoryski were very close to Kapodistria and other memorandums that I have seen in Russian archives. This plan of Czartoryski was very influenced because among intellectuals who were Ottoman subjects and became Russian subjects. It's very, and you know, principalities, it's very, very, very interesting case because principalities was a Balkan region for the Russians, and the Kapodistrias worked hard to create the codes, the law codes for principalities. Sturza was from Bessarabia, and Bessarabia, this region, has a very huge autonomy, like Finland. It is very interesting aspect for what kind of empire was the Russian Empire. We have to rethink a lot of things about Russia in order to conclude what Russia was. And I think that there is a very interesting historiography after the 1891, after the collapse of Soviet Union, when historians started to think more freely and more, interesting, let's say that.
Thank you.
Can I just leap in? Because I know we want to hear from some of the people on the screen. All I want to say really is that we don't have enough time, but I'm looking forward to our future meetings on other Philhellenisms, because it seems to me that especially in the case of Russia, it's a great opportunity really to bring in more, as you say, of what people themselves thought of themselves as the Christian identity. And so if what's exciting about contemporary, this past generation of scholarship, is that we don't have this sense that there's an irreconcilable binary between the Orthodox and the Hellenic. That this is actually something that I think we don't, maybe still people who think especially about European, French or British Philhellenism have that way of thinking. But I think what's exciting about the way we talk about it in Greece or Russia, clearly from your comments, is that we don't need those to keep these separate. Actually, the people who were writing about are not keeping them separate. So I would like, in some of our further meetings to really work on that new development, that we don't have to keep these. And we must bring the Orthodox dimension in, because they had it in there. I mean, it's possible that some of the people waiting to ask questions might want to bring that out. I don't know, but is there a chat function, or how do they?
There is. For this, I need to ask our Antti Lampinen to take care of that one and let me know here. If there is no comments from the other side, from the screen side, I actually want us to make a couple of sentences as a conclusion, I thought, in this, because now what I find the most interesting kind of outcome, and later on there will be more thoughts, but one of the outcomes is that we can also now start asking the question, to whom does the Philhellenism in one way belong? Whom did it belong? Who we think that it belonged? If it was, as you say, regarded as somehow nice, fine thing that's mostly for those who are educated, who move in higher circles. So then, how it's looked at from the other side, from the root grass level, and then how different does it look? Whom does those people there think that it belonged, and the other way around? So we could continue with thinking all of these kinds of aspects, and I really do hope that this is not the last time we talk about Russian Philhellenism and the role of a Philhellenism in the more Eastern spheres, and also welcome all the aspects for us to make us learn more Philhellenism in general through that context that we were able to place it this evening. So thank you all. I think that we are clear. Thank you for everyone coming, wherever you have been.
Thank you.
Thank you for all of you here. Thank you for our technical team as well.